So, without further ado, we're absolutely delighted to welcome this evening Peter Kellner.
John, thank you very much. May I make two initial throat-clearing points? The first is, I know if more people come in, there'll be pressure on space. If any of you are here because you're hoping or expect me to say something new about the Scottish referendum, I'm not going to. So if you want to leave knowing that, feel free. The second thing is I look around and I'm daunted by the array of friends, colleagues, former colleagues, incredibly distinguished academics and practitioners. But I hope you'll forgive me if I single out one, my very good friend David Butler here, who is 90 next month, who I can testify has not lost an ounce of the sharpness and detailed knowledge and memory with which many of us grew up watching on election nights. And I suspect, certainly for me, and I suspect for many people here, we would not be crunching political numbers had it not been for the example David set and for many of us the friendship he has given us. So I'm especially delighted that David, a long-time active member of the Hansard Society, is here. When I set out to prepare this lecture, I started with, I think, a fairly conventional set of ideas about political parties, what was wrong with declining membership, what to do about it. But as my thinking and my reading crystallised, I came to a different set of conclusions from those I expected. So let me take you on my journey. And let me start with a real, if somewhat extreme, then and now comparison. Barnsley. 1950, turnout 89%. 2010, turnout 56%. Labour vote, and these were similar electorate sizes, Labour vote in 1950, 42,000. 2010, 17,000. The first job of the MP elected in 2010 had been, at the age of 13, to go down the mines. The first job of the MP elected in 2010 had been a graduate official at the National Union of Mine Workers. A year after the 1950 election, the MP, Frank Collingridge, had died from pneumoconiosis. A year after the 2010 election, Eric Ilsley was in jail for fiddling his expenses. As I say, a somewhat extreme then and now, but if you want to encapsulate the public perception of the decline of politics, of behaviour, of parties, there you have it in heightened form. Now let's step back and look more generally as what has happened. Party membership is down in this country a lot. It is down in most democracies by a lot. The main European exceptions are France, Italy and Spain. And the fall in Britain, as far as I can see, has been the greatest proportionately of any country outside the former Soviet bloc, where, of course, the history of Communist Party membership and what that denoted has a rather special history. So Britain is at the high end of the reduction in party membership. But again, as we all know, there are three insurgent parties that defy that trend: the Greens, UKIP and SNP. And I call SNP still an insurgent party because although they have been in government now in Scotland for some years, the cause of independence is reaching its insurgent peak next week. Another thing we all know is that election turnouts are down. Not everywhere, but again, in most democracies. But again, Britain is at the far end of the decline. In fact, the only two countries that I can see that have a comparable record of decline in turnout over the last 15 or so years are Greece and Israel. I'm not terribly sure those are countries all of us wish to be in the same company as. But on the other hand, there are exceptions. In France, for example, in presidential elections, the turnout that brought Hollande to office was one of its highest. And in America, where you have different issues of registration and so on, again, the two Obama elections have seen some steadying or even perhaps partial reversal of decline. Partisanship is down. Half a century ago, roughly half the electorate strongly identified with one of the parties. It's now around 10%. And as we all know, trust in politics and politicians is down. Iraq, MPs' expenses, for example. But what we at YouGov find is this doesn't just apply to politicians. It applies to all kinds of authority, i.e., whether you look at police or businessmen or whatever, business leaders, it's not just people involved in being deceived over weapons of mass destruction or fiddling their expenses. There is something wider going on in terms of public distrust of figures in authority. The only group which seems to be defying this are judges. Make what you will of that. But the other thing, and I'm going to come back to this later, is that quite apart from those sort of numerically observable phenomena, I think that either government has got a lot worse in terms of its competence of policy making and policy delivery, or if it's not got worse, we've been in trouble for a very long time. And what I'm going to argue is that the real test of any proposal for reviving our politics and reviving our political parties is not some self-referencing indicator to do with turnout or party membership, but whether actually the political system proves more capable of designing sensible policies and actually implementing them effectively. Now, when we look at it that way, are bigger parties a part of the solution? And this is where I start to deviate from where I expected to be when I agreed to do this lecture. The case for saying yes, bigger parties are part of the solution, some of them are that there's too little difference between the parties. We need more division, more passion, more things for people to get worked up about, for people to be passionate and to join parties for. If we had bigger and better parties, perhaps we would have MPs who had more experience of real life. We've seen the transformation of parliaments into one where a much higher proportion of MPs have never really had a life outside politics or quasi-politics, which I include journalism. There's quasi-politics, think tanks, the law, and so on. Perhaps if we had parties which engage more of the public, perhaps there might be less of the sort of Yardoo confrontational behaviour we see. And perhaps also bigger, more broadly based parties would have more broadly based funding, would be less dependent upon trade unions, rich donors, whatever. So that, I think, is the normal case that's made. But I'd like to draw your attention to a paradox, because one of the things that has happened in my adult lifetime, one of the big things, which I imagine most of us have welcomed, is that the biggest decisions within parties, principally who they elect as their leader, has been taken from MPs and given to their entire this surely makes parties more democratic. And yet, it seems to me that the more say parties give to individual members, the less attention they pay to the activist minorities. I remember grim days in the Labour Party in North London in the 1980s, dealing with militants. Some of you here will have been involved, most of you over the age of 40 will, I guess, remember it. The less attention parties pay to their activists, the more power they give their leaders. And I'll give you a very particular example. One of the first films I made for Newsnight was during the leadership challenge to Margaret Thatcher in 1989, not the one from Heseltine, the year earlier. And we filmed Nick Budgeon, then the Conservative MP in Wolverhampton, South West, talking to his constituency activists. And he says to me, if we give the power to select our leader to the individual members, we will never get rid of bad leaders. We would never, we would still have Edward Heath. Because at Edward Heath, after the second 74 defeat, sort of vote of confidence from the party membership, he would have remained leader. We would not have had Margaret Thatcher. You may regard that as a good thing or a bad thing. But equally, they would probably not have got rid of Margaret Thatcher in 1990. So, the involvement of individual members gives the leader more power. And the more power the leader has, the more ability he or she has to impose their own will on the party's policies. And what they will then do, what they do, what we see them doing, is then pay less attention to the activists to the left in the case of the Labour Party, to the right in the case of the Conservative Party, and more, if you like, to the numbers that people like me produce. They want to find out what the floating voters are thinking because they're the people they want. And they have less restraint in this era where individuals have more say. And the more party leaders pay attention to polls, to focus groups, and other means of trying to work out how to win those undecided voters, assuming they're reasonably intelligent, they will come to roughly the same conclusions. Labour and Conservative leaders efficiently trying to appeal to the same people and understand them, if they're sensible about it and they do it properly, they will arrive at the same answers. And so you get convergence. The more convergence, the less, quote, real choice. I know I'm sounding a bit like Nigel Farage does or Nick Clegg used to, and the difference is I'm not sure this is a bad thing. But to carry on with the paradox, the more convergence you get, the less passion, the harder it is to recruit new members. Because parties recruit for reasons of culture, tribe, doctrine, whatever, but because they are different. The more parties are the same, the less ability there is to say, we are different, come and join us in this great struggle. So, and this is where my paradox comes full circle, the more powers parties have given their individual members, if you follow my logic, the fewer members they end up having. And I think that's a critical part of what we've seen, and if you like, why Britain is at the sharp end of the decline in party memberships compared with other countries. Which leads me to the question, well, if parties are going to converge, I'm talking here about the mainstream parties. I'll come on to the insurgent parties a bit later. If the mainstream parties are going to converge, then it strikes me one has to ask, well, what really are parties for. And let me suggest there are a whole range of reasons for having political parties, but in terms of, as it were, party competition, let me highlight two. One is there is an obvious and plain democratic need to have a choice. You need a load of people running the country, and you need another load of people who you can put in their place if you want to kick the current lot out. You need parties to provide an alternative. Now, that's an alternative team of people. Do you need, and this is the second proposition, do you need parties to have more that divides them apart from simply being two alternative groups? Do we have to have big differences of doctrine or interest? And here is where I think the 21st century is different from the 19th and 20th century, and I think it's quite fundamental. Because the party system we've grown up with in Britain, firstly in the 18th and 19th century, the Whigs versus the Tories, commerce versus land, if you like, and as I'm sure many of you know, and those who don't, let me tell you, that originally when it was Whigs versus Tories, they were both originally terms of insult devised by the other. Whig was initially a Scottish Gaelic term for horse thieves, and Tory was an Irish term for a papist outlaw. You can see, and if you want to throw it in, by the way, the term Prime Minister was first used, we know all that Robert Walpole was the first Prime Minister, but the term Prime Minister was first used by Walpole's critics to attack him for attracting too much power to himself. So all these sort of terms sort of come round. But so we had in the 19th century, Whig, Tory, Liberal, Conservative, and you see through debates like the Corn Laws, for example, you see real clashes of interest and of doctrine flowing from interest. Then in the 20th century, you had the clash of ideology, socialism, capitalism. And what I'd like to suggest to you is that not only is that plainly over, but I can't see anything equivalent to replace that, if you like, left-right division of either land and interest in the 19th century and ideology and class in the 20th century. So, we come back to the question, can parties be more than simply rival teams of people able to take part in government? Well, my answer is that actually it is healthy for there to be convergence. Sometimes people criticise politicians for looking too much like businesses, and I think actually businesses provide really useful tool of analysis. That Tesco and Sainsbury are rivals. There are differences, there is branding, but they're not massively different. And of course then insurgents come along, like Aldi and Lidl, and they have to respond. If you're buying electronic goods, are any of us really passionate whether our television is made by Samsung or Panasonic? Now, probably, as with politics, a small number are passionate, but most people aren't. And I think that if you've got a convergent system, you can have a competition which spurs innovation and also spurs imitation. And I think imitation is a good thing. If one party comes up with a good idea, surely it is better for other parties to adopt it than to carry along with rotten ideas. So, to use a sort of sporting metaphor, it seems to me that party contest has, in the nature of things, it's shifted from 200 years of tug of war to something more like the Tour de France. Instead of two teams pulling in opposite directions, and that is the contest, it's people actually racing in the same direction, trying to get to the winning post first. Now, I'm not saying there are no differences between Labour and Conservative. Obviously there are, at any given time. There are a number of specific differences. My argument is that these days, actually, they share a common ideology. There is not a difference of fundamental doctrine. They both believe in managed capitalism with cyclically adjusted state spending at around 40% of GDP. Yes, you get arguments, and sometimes noisy arguments, which boil down to whether it should be 42% or 41%. But you're not getting a party saying we should be like Sweden and have 50% or like America and have 30%. And not only that, over the last 30 years or so, the Labour Party has accepted the Thatcherite reforms on trade unions, privatisation, freer labour markets, and the Conservatives have accepted the minimum wage, the protection of NHS spending, equal rights laws. You know, it was only, a quarter of a century ago that Clause 28 did so much damage into the gay world, and now you have a Conservative government actually moving from civil partnership to gay marriage. And the differences that I observe amongst my friends in the Labour Party and the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats, those differences, I think, these days actually reflect their party's history and cultural legacy. They're sort of shadows from the past. There are not, in my view, any fundamental difference in their current doctrine. Now, this is where we come on to the insurgents, because, of course, when you get that degree of fundamental convergence, that leaves space to the right and to the left for those people who do have fundamentally different ideas to come along. So, UKIP, Greens, SNP in Scotland. And I think this is absolutely right, because mainstream parties like Tesco and Sainsbury's, they can, in their sort of duopoly, become somewhat flabby and complacent. And so, as it were, UKIP and the Greens, I think, perform, and the Liberals, before they had delusions of grandeur, played an incredibly important part in as ginger groups to the main parties, just as now Lidl and Aldi are changing the way Tesco and Sainsbury's work out how they proceed. But let me make this prediction, and here I will relate to Scotland, that if Scotland does become independent, then I think over the next, say, 20 years, the SNP's trajectory will be a bit like that of the Congress Party in India or the ANC in South Africa. It will start off as the absolutely dominant force, but in time it will become flabby, it will start to fracture, competitors will come along, and I reckon its membership will start to decline, because it will become, in its own world, a mainstream party and suffer the fate of mainstream parties. So, what's the way forward? Let me start with these propositions. The 21st century is, as I've argued, fundamentally different from the 21st century in the nature of political debate and the function of parties. Secondly, the golden age of politics was never that golden. Just read some of Chris Bryant's wonderful anecdotes in the history of Parliament about Asquith taking major decisions and coming before Parliament completely drunk. There are many examples. I think in our hearts we know that that there was never really a pure time of respectful division that led to really productive outcomes. And if you want negative campaigning, read Churchill's speech, the first radio broadcast, the 1945 election campaign, when he talked about a Labour government being like the Gestapo. Churchill, descending to a gutter that I think even, I don't know, I won't name them, but you know the usual suspects on the Labour and Tory benches. I'm not sure any of them would descend quite that low today. Third proposition, that actually the power of governments is either less than it was, or we at least are aware, perhaps more than we used to be, of the limitations of the power of governments. That unless we opt out of globalisation, trade, company investment decisions and so on impose real limits on what you can do with your economy, with your trade policy and so on. In as far as there is now acceptance that we are a managed capitalist society, there are limits on what you can persuade the private sector to do, and you don't, thank goodness, have all these wretched nationalised industries to boss about. Fourth proposition, and here I suspect, if I haven't already, I will get into real trouble here. Much of the business of government today is actually largely a technical exercise with limited power, and which actually doesn't need broad public involvement to be done effectively, any more than Tesco or Sainsbury's or Panasonic or Samsung or whoever needs to keep asking their customers every 5 minutes to come and design their next product. So what I'm going to suggest to you is that if there is a crisis, and I think there is, it's not a crisis actually of parties per se, or of doctrine, but the ability of actually generally sensible, intelligent and public-spirited politicians and civil servants to come together to devise sensible policies and make them work. Let me commend to you, I think, two of the best political books of the last few years that have come out in the last few months. One is The Blunders of Our Governments by Tony King and Ivor Crewe, and the other is The Too Difficult Box, a book of essays edited by Charles Clarke. Blunders of Our Government speaks for itself. The Too Difficult Box, the proposition is there are certain issues which our political system is actually very bad at handling because they're awkward or they're long term, and the party competition actually gets in the way of tackling them. So, a quick reprise down memory lane. Blunders. Poll tax, ERM, Child Support Agency, Assets Recovery Agency, individual learning accounts, welfare reform, tax credits under Labour, universal credits under the current coalition, government technology schemes, NHS, Passport Office, many more, banking and pension regulation, lending, mis-selling, health reform under this government, drugs legislation under every government. The list goes on. And when I go through that list, the question I want you to have in your mind is, what would bigger party memberships or differently configured parties, since we're thinking about the future of political parties, what would they contribute to preventing these blunders? Because that's, I think, the key test. Now, from the too difficult box, and again, I'm just going to pluck out 5 from more than a dozen in the book. Britain's infrastructure. Roads, sewers, railways, so on. Pensions and care of the elderly, in an era when we're living longer. Climate change. Nuclear power, carbon storage, negotiating with other countries. Housing, the madness of not being able to build enough houses, having a runaway housing market, having a taxation system which nobody, if he was starting from here, would remotely devise. And yet no government has the gumption to put it right. And then there's the wider question of funding public services. If you take the 3 broad areas of spending, which together one can roughly define as social democracy, welfare payments, health and education, go back to the early 1950s, which is as far back as we have comparable data, they consumed 11% of gross domestic product. They now consume getting on for 30% of gross domestic product. A chunk of that increase has come from the cut in our defence spending, which was 9% in the early 50s. So we spent almost as much on defence as on health, education and welfare put together, now 2%. So thank you, peace dividend, we've spent it, and there isn't any more to come. Otherwise, it has one way or another been tax rises. If you had a manual job 60 years ago, you paid little or no income tax. You now pay a reasonable amount. The cost pressures are going to go on growing. It is the nature of these things as we live longer, as health technology advances, as we want to be in school and college longer, the costs carry on rising. And yet, we just lurch from one short-term decision to another. And the point I want to make, again, I'm going through a list which will be familiar to most of you, but the point I want to put to you is this, that these are only ever going to be solved if there is some consistency over 10, 20, 30 years. If we had 5-year or even 10-year alternating radically different governments of left and right, do any of us seriously think that we would make more progress in tackling these issues? So again, it feeds back to my proposition that convergence is not merely a product of the end of the ideological struggle of the 20th century, it is also a necessary component of a rational politics for the 21st century. So, solutions. And this is where I arrived at a position where I sort of largely threw out the notions I started with. Half a dozen propositions which are sometimes advanced by different people, and some of you here will be strongly in favour of some or all of them. Bigger party memberships, different electoral system, devices to increase the turnout at election time, referendums and more direct democracy, more MPs with experience of real life, more independently minded MPs. Now, I like some of these more than others. I don't like referendums and I don't want proportional representation. I would like a higher turnout and I would like more independently minded MPs. But if we're hard-headed about it, can any of us really say that any of those things, let alone all of them would stop the blunders we'd experienced or tackle the too difficult box long-term issues. And that must be the test. Democracy obviously has the most enormous intrinsic virtues. I'm here because my father, an Austrian Jew, ended up in Britain because he wanted to live in democracy. But democracy has to serve a function other beyond its own glorification. So, what should we do? What would make a difference? Now, at this point, I would love to unfold a great dramatic program to say, here is the answer. This is what we've all been missing for decades. We all know really it isn't like that. Democracy is difficult. It's messy. It's uncertain. It is never going to get all that much right. It's never going to get everything right. It will often not get the majority right. We want to get more of it right than it does now. So I'm going to give you some bits of suggestions which I think could together make a practical difference. The first is, I do think we need to move to more local powers. Classically, this is something that every opposition promises and no government delivers. But I think there's a special reason now. This is, if you like, this is the good news about where the 21st century is different. That precisely because of modern technology, it is possible for people to get information completely free and as fully as they want. So you can have many more local decisions, whether it's out-of-town shopping centres, whether it's double yellow lines, whether it's one-way systems, whether it's to do with planning permission, and so on. It seems to me that technology does enable a much richer form of consultation. I'm not going to be prescriptive about whether you do it in the form of local referendums or not. What I'm saying is that if you did cede more power locally, there are then best practices that we could develop and learn from, in which the exercise of that greater power is done in a more fluid and more consultative way that involves people making more of their decisions about their own communities. Secondly, and that's at the other end, I think one of the best examples of really sensible, good government was the Canadians in the mid-90s, when they faced a big financial problem, an incoming Liberal government in the mid-90s. They knew there was a substantial financial problem, and they felt that the only way they could tackle it without just horrendous increases in taxes and stuffing business was to have really very large cuts. And so they embarked on, I think, a 2-year open process where they prepared documents, they circulated them, ministers went out, they had consultations, everything was done absolutely transparency, parties and civil society in all its various forms and institutions were involved. And at the end of the 2 years, the strategy was unveiled. And part of that strategy, incidentally, was giving more power to the provinces, but requiring them to make some of the tough decisions in their own provinces. And it was tough. It was not nice. There was lots of squealing. But because the public had been taken along on the journey, there was both an understanding of the issues and the realization that the issues were tough and difficult, and an appreciation of the process, of feeling at the end that the cuts had been designed in the right way. It wasn't a Chancellor of the Exchequer in London suddenly coming out of Purdah and out of the blue announcing what was going to happen, and the opposition then shouting at him. So far it always has been him. This was a very, very different kind of process. I think there's a lot we can learn from there. I think we need to respond to the falling party memberships, not with the, as you can imagine, I now believe, the vain hope of reversing that, but by making parties more porous and more open. And I think Sarah Wollaston is, I think and hope, is the first of a new breed of MPs whose selection to fight the seat involves a great many more people beyond the party membership. So the parties need to be much more outward looking. But equally, if parties are to be more intelligent, I think they have to have more resources for policy development, and that I think has to mean state funding. Do I like the idea of state funding? No. But I think pure voluntary funding and under-resourced parties that don't have the real capacity to develop their own policies, that's a worse thing than an element of state funding and the resources. And I do think one of the reasons why German politics is on the whole more mature, I don't believe it's on the whole because of their electoral system. I think it's because if as many of you will have been involved in joint programmes with either the Friedrich Ebert Foundation or the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, the major well-resourced sort of think tanks associated with the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats. One isn't talking about a large increase in public expenditure. One is talking about some tens of millions of pounds. One's not talking billions. I would like to return to the days, and this is where one thing I think it was better half a century ago, was when special advisors were serious special people. Christopher Foster knew his stuff on transport with Barbara Castle as minister, did some really good things. Victor Rothschild running the think tank and Downing Street for Edward Heath. I think the whole phenomenon of special advisors has been absolutely debased by, and I'm sorry, I suspect a number of you are here, but, people in their 20s out of university. A useful role and perhaps worth having in ministers and shadow ministers' teams, but can we either instead or as well have the big beast outsiders who know their stuff? I would like to see a much more open civil service, which, if you like, relates to my Canada point. These days, I frankly don't see any reason why the great majority of policy advice papers shouldn't be published when they're written. And I think the fiction that everything is internal for the minister and the minister is the sole outward face of the department, we know this is ludicrous. I mean, it's a neat fiction which might have been relevant at the end of the 19th century, when the minister knew every official in their department. It is simply absurd now. And if you imagine that those proposals are pie in the sky, wait till you hear my last one, which is we really do need just a lot more courtesy and respect. One of the things I find odd, and again, I'm sure many of you will have had the same experience, when you are in a small gathering with MPs of different parties, for example, at conferences abroad, the Königswinter Anglo-German, or the other kinds of things, or when there's fact-finding trips, do you find them behaving like they do at Prime Minister's question times? Of course you don't. You find them having very civilised discussions in which often they agree about 90%. Now, the 10% they disagree about may be really vital. But why is it that these intelligent and civilised people sit them down at noon on Wednesday or put them in front of a microphone on the Today programme or Newsnight and they turn into these monsters. Is it going to change? I fear not. But in not changing, I think we're going to pay the price. Let me make my final point, which is that if what I've said sounds like I want to make politics less passionate and more technocratic, well, there's a bit of truth in that, but I don't believe that a technically competent government system need extrude all passion, all argument, all difference. It's just that those differences, those passionate differences of values and social outlook, need to take place in the whole of society. I think the role of political parties, especially of mainstream parties that are in or aspire to government, is different. And so, yes, I do think we need more technically competent government. And I am glad that parties are more convergent. And I don't think, therefore, that parties, having shrunk in size, are going to grow very much from here. But I don't think that is necessarily a bad thing, providing we deal with all the other things which really would make a difference to people's lives.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. Plenty there for people to get their teeth into. We'll take questions in a second. As said earlier, if you can wait till the microphone reaches you, please, before asking your question so that it's recorded properly. We'd like questions, not statements, please, and preferably short ones. I would be delighted if there's a special advisor in the room who would like to ask a question, particularly if there's a special advisor who's very, very keen on Samsung or Aldi. That would be really, really good. I can see at the back there, maybe take questions in batches of two. So we'll start with the two here, there, and then there. Yes.
Thank you very much. Keith Best, former Member of Parliament and Chair of the Electoral Reform International Services. Peter, thank you so much for a very thought-provoking and obviously well-thought-through contribution. I do hope that history won't hold you responsible for having precipitated Scottish independence as a result of the YouGov poll. But it seems to me, and Peter Hennessy was saying this morning, I'm sure you heard him on the Today programme, but whether it's a no vote or a yes vote, the whole relationship between Westminster and Scotland will have changed forever, inevitably. Does this not mean that we are going to see then increasing pressure for an English Parliament, and that we are going to see Westminster more and more sidelined into one that just talks about how much cooperation on foreign affairs there might be with Europe?
And second question, we'll take them in batches of two. Just there.
David Howth, University of Cambridge. Sorry, another ex-MP. There's not very many of us in the room when we're asking the first questions. The question is, Peter, I really hope you're right, but there's one question mark about your basic premise, which is that ideological interest politics come to an end, and that's about immigration. Because yes, if you look at the electorate, and look at the data in the British election study and so on, in terms of economic attitudes, you're right, the electorate is broadly centre-lefty with a distribution around it. But if you look at immigration, attitudes to immigration, especially attitudes, cultural attitudes, not economic attitudes, there's a big divide. And that divide is social, not just in terms of view, because it divides on age, it divides on income, and especially it divides in education. And that divide, educational divide, is something that's happening all over Europe. That's how politics is developing. And it seems to me the real problem is that we have two big groups in the electorate. One which is broad in economic view terms, very anti-immigration, and one which is centre-lefty in economic terms and quite open to immigration. And we have three parties competing for each of those two groups. I'll let you work out which those three parties are. But my challenge to you is this. The one party that's competing in both groups and therefore really threatened by this whole development is Labour. And Labour's holding the lid on this situation, but whether that can survive the growth of UKIP is something I question.
Keith's question about Scotland. Since I don't know what's going to happen next week, I agree with you that whatever happens, change will be immense. But let us assume that Scotland votes no and has a serious further devolution. Should there be an English Parliament? The problem I have, and it's a problem which, maybe is capable of solution, I don't know, is that if you're to have an English Parliament, it's not enough to say, right, you've got an English Parliament, a Welsh Parliament, a Northern Irish Parliament, and then some sort of federal Parliament. Given the lopsidedness of England being 90% of what's left, how that would work in practice. And at the moment, every scheme I've seen, whether it's an English grand jury or English MPs alone taking decisions on issues that affect only England, though actually that's not many, because by the time you factor in anything to do with tax powers, you're dealing with Britain-wide powers. You end up, it seems to me, at the moment, with this choice. You either have a ludicrously inconsistent system that works, or a perfectly rational system which doesn't work. I would prefer, if that is the choice, a ludicrous system that works. And it seems to me, therefore, the challenge to those who favour, as it were, an English Parliament or English politicians deciding English issues, given this mismatch in populations, design a system that doesn't just look nice, but will actually work in practice. So I would throw that back. David's question on immigration, I think this is actually a really good example of where parties play one role and the wider society plays a different role. Because I don't think there is a serious politician in any of the big parties who thinks that the kind of cut in immigration that most voters tell YouGov they want will be anything other than complete economic and social lunacy. Right? So, it is part of the job of, if you like, the political classes to disabuse people of ludicrous ideas. That said, what I think the polling shows, if you look beyond the answers to the question, how many immigrants do you want? You look at what's causing the dislike of immigrants. And it is concerns about jobs, about housing, about crime, and so on. Then what politicians should be doing is listening to what is really worrying the voters and addressing those causes. I think an efficient, one of the reasons why, or one of the examples why our political system is not working very well, is that our parties, for the reasons you give, are actually, I think, ducking the real challenge, which is to argue the case for much more immigration than people want, however that is specifically managed, and then saying, but we recognise this causes the following problems and this is how we solve them. And I think that the public dislike of immigration is largely allowed to continue by a debate in the political classes, which I think is deeply inadequate.
The next question is on the back right here. No, not the far back, but Vernon, basically, the silver fox on the...
Vernon Podgenall, not an ex-MP, but an academic. My question follows on from David's, really.
was surprised to hear about elite convergence, because obviously there's no convergence on immigration, there's no convergence on Europe. There are large numbers of people in the country, on one or two polls a majority, who want Britain to leave the European Union, though of course all three party leaders are in favour of staying. There's not convergence on the issue of gay marriage, except amongst MPs. There are large numbers of people in the country who are against the reform. There's not convergence on grammar schools. There are a large number of people in the country who want more grammar schools. Three major party leaders don't. Not convergence on HS2. Three party leaders want it. Large swathes of opinion don't want it. Now, on all these matters, there's a huge cleavage, and I think David's right that it's a meritocratic cleavage. It's on the whole a cleavage between those who've been through higher education and what you might call the left behind, semi-skilled or unskilled people. And those people tend not to be represented. They're screened out by the party system, partly by the electoral system, because they tend to live in safe seats. And the Labour Party used to represent them, but doesn't effectively now, because they're not in the marginal seats and they're not a majority. And so what's wrong with our party system? It doesn't represent very well. We may all be pleased about that, because I think on all the issues I mentioned, we're all on one side. We're all on the same side. But a lot of people in this country are not. And the party system isn't representing them. It represents us marvellously. It doesn't represent them.
Well, the next question is right at the back, please. I'll come back to you. Right at the back first. I was going to say, Vernon, judging by some of the reactions around the room, I'm not sure everyone in the room is on the same side as you, but we'll come on to that maybe in a minute. Yes?
John Strafford, author of Our Fight for Democracy. Peter, you said in your speech that the more powers you give to party members, the fewer members you get. Could I say to you, that's unmitigated rubbish. If I take the Conservative Party, in the last 20 years, they no longer have debates at their party conference or votes on them. Their role in selecting candidates has been totally diminished. They have no annual general meeting of members or regional meetings. They can't elect the party chairman or treasurer. And on the one issue that you mentioned where they've been given more power in a leadership election, the MP stitches up beforehand by only giving them a choice of two. So the idea that they have been given more power is just totally, utterly wrong. And what the people have understood is that consultations mean nothing. The only thing that counts is votes. And when they're voting for something, and that is why in the Scottish referendum, because they know that their vote will count, you get a higher turnout than we've seen in a generation. That's the issue. People want power, and the politicians have got to recognise it.
John's, I think, was a comment rather than a question.
I think it's, at the end there was an implied question, which is, do you agree with me? If you deal with it in that, deal with it.
John, I set out my view, you set out yours. We can carry on a drink afterwards, but I've said what I've said. Let me deal with Vernon's point. I think, Vernon, with respect, you're making actually a slightly different point. I'm not saying there are no big divisions in society in terms of art, in terms of issues, and you've listed a number of them. What I'm saying is, when you go through those, they're not actually differences of fundamental political doctrine. Europe, and in fact, they all, to a greater or lesser extent, divide one or more parties. So gay marriage in Europe divides the Conservatives, grammar schools to a degree, not everybody in Labour, there's a difference in Labour over things like charter schools. HS2 is not an issue that divides parties. But that's my point. I mean, I think what one needs to do is look at the process of political debate on a much wider canvas than parties. So I see no contradiction between saying that parties can, in terms of fundamental doctrine, converge, between that and saying out there are different groups and societies, because one could have added in different views on climate change, for example, many issues. That the debate, the argument, people join groups that are passionate about that, as they do. As they do on, High Speed 2 or Europe or whatever. The question is not whether one should have these debates or these differences. Of course you should, and of course there should be mechanisms by which people come together to argue their case. What I'm saying is that if we get into a position where you get a permanent political schism between the two main parties who just keep on reversing each other's policies, that will be bad for Britain. Now, sometimes, and Europe may be an example, just like, I don't know, the Corn Laws were in the middle of the 19th century, sometimes there are issues that have to be fought and dealt with. And maybe every 30 or 40 years we have to do this with Europe. But on the basis that once you've dealt with it, the parties accept that and carry on. Because if I come back to my point, if you're going to have sensible or long-term solutions to any or all of Britain's problems, you can't have some of these issues. I mean, HS2 again. That has got to be resolved at some point. We can't build 100 miles and then have a government that says, well, we're not going to build any more. Well, that may be what happens. If it does, it's not very clever. It would not be a triumph of democracy to have parties alternating and building and not building HS2. So, the question is not whether these differences exist, not whether people should have arguments, not whether there should be institutions that wage these battles, but what the role of political parties are in that. And that's perhaps where we still disagree.
Okay, we've got 10 minutes left. I'm not going to be able to get everybody in, but there was a woman at the back there whose hand went up, please. Yes, yeah.
Hello. Peter, I'd like to take you up on 2 points. One is about the party's public image and media image. I mean, you must be aware that they've had the most terrible PR for a very long time, and I'm always surprised, don't you think we ought to address the fact that there are millions of people who never read a book about politics, never watch the news, don't read newspapers, profess not to be interested, and yet consider themselves absolute experts in having the certain knowledge that all parties are corrupt and every single politician is corrupt. Now, if that is not a brilliant trick on the part of somebody, so that is something that needs to be addressed. It's a very serious question, that paradox. And secondly, I'm not sure that the size of political parties in terms of membership is really relevant anymore. Because if you compare the past, the parties were one of the few organisations that people could join. But now, with the enormous proliferation of local, national and international pressure groups, civil society organisations, charities, fundraising and so on, I don't believe that, evidently many people are involved and are active. And they are on specialist issues, or, the single issues as they're called. But there's ever more single issues on which they're active on. So simply, that they don't have to be in a party to do that. And parties, the important thing is the relationship between the two, which you haven't talked about.
I'll take one more. There was a chap here, please. Yeah.
Thank you. David Giles, Kent County Council. I was interested in exploring your idea of devolving to the local a bit further. Obviously, you've made your comments about an English Parliament very clear, and I, for one, personally agree. England's a very culturally diverse place anyway. But I was wondering, what sort of level do you think would be most effective, and also which would be most popular, and what's the difference going to be between the two? Would you go for the old regional assemblies, the local enterprise partnerships? Would you go to county or even district level?
Oh, golly. I'll try and buy myself time to think about the second question. The media image, you're absolutely right, but don't the politicians make it far too easy for the public to have those views? That's the point. Another paradox is that the more that the process of in the 90s, do you remember when it was a spasm of minor scandals that led to the Nolan reforms and the transparency and so on, led to the expenses round and expenses stories, scandal. And that was because so much more was put in the public domain. The trouble with transparency is that, and I think, if you like, it's Kellner's law of transparency. Transparency is supposed to induce more trust. It almost invariably induces less trust. That's not an argument for less transparency. It's an argument for being very aware. If you're going to go down the transparency route, you've really got to have much better behaviour and possibly much more sensible rules. You know, if the MPs had called it an allowance system, not an expense system, we wouldn't have had most of the problems we had. As to the point about single issues, I mean, yes, but I think, I think this comes to the point, and it links to Vernon's point, in my view, is that I think a large part of the role of parties is to mediate all these different concerns. So you have one lobby for more health spending, one for education spending, one for, you know, whatever, child benefit, one for pensions, one for HS2, one against HS2. And there are going to be a complex series of trade-offs. And it seems to me one of the central required functions of the political process is to grasp this swirling confusion of contradictory and competing claims and provide a coherent and understood and acceptable process for mediating between them, which is one reason why I think it's actually a healthy thing for a lot of these specific causes to be dealt with or promoted by single issue groups and for parties to have a different function. So I think you've helped, as well, clarify perhaps my expression of that. David, I don't know is the answer. And I think what we need is a process, is a journey. I think in Britain we've actually forgotten how to do local rule. We've forgotten how to do what the Victorian great city leaders did. I think some of the things we've had, elected mayors and even more elected police commissioners, I think are just barking mad ideas. What I would like to see is a permissive approach, and for different cities, different counties, different communities, different sizes, to do things differently over the next 10 or 20 years. And let us see what works best. And it may be that it's, in some places it's a region, in other places it's city or county. Increasingly I believe that democracy works best when we don't try and make it too tidy. When we accept that it's bumpy, it's ugly, it's contradictory, it's awkward, it's disappointing. Accept that and weave the best way we can through it. So I think the answer I come to your question is I'd be against a one-size-fits-all blueprint.
Okay, time for one more. Suddenly there's loads of hands going up. I'm afraid I've already got them stacked up. There was a chap here in glasses just to your right. Yeah. He's not in glasses, he's wearing glasses, but there you go.
Student at JFS. You briefly mentioned and then dismissed electoral reform and other electoral systems as a way of improving our democracy. Why do you think this? What if you had to choose a different electoral system? Which one? Why? I guess. Thank you.
And there was a woman just there. Yeah, hand went up at the back. And if we could take these, you've got, depending on how long this question is, about 3 minutes.
Okay.
Natalia Francesca from consultancy PLMR. You mentioned quite a few times or compared political parties to well-known brands. Would you then say that party activists could be considered as clients of the parties? The parties... Clients, customers. Parties.
Okay. I can give short answers. No, the customers of the voters. The activists are the employees, and if you wish to extend it, maybe one brand which is very popular, which I haven't mentioned, is John Lewis, which has a system of internal internal democracy, but it's not a democracy in a conventional sense. It's a form of internal consultation. Maybe there's the model. Electoral system. Short answer, in the AV referendum 2 years ago, I was one of that tiny minority that voted for AV because I wanted AV, not because I wanted a stepping stone to proportionality. I liked AV because I like our constituency system, but I think in a multi-party world, I think first past the post no longer works, and you need MPs with more legitimacy, which you get through the alternative vote process. But at the end of the day, we have a parliamentary system. Like it or not, the principal function of a general election is to provide a government. And proportional systems, I think, will be messier. But hey, this could be the start of maybe next year's lecture by somebody else.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Peter. Thank you all of you for coming. Apologies again for the problems with the room that were beyond our control and Hansard's control. Plenty there to get you thinking on the journey home. I will spend the journey home thinking, trying to work out which party is John Lewis and which party is Aldi. You also encountered tonight Kellner's law, which is, I think, worth remembering. As a parting gesture, I will give you Cowley's law of local government, which is that anybody who ever argues for more powers for local government has never had to deal with Lambeth Council. And on that note, if you could thank Peter in the usual manner, please.